In the heart of a quaint English village, nestled among rolling hills and fields aglow with the golden hue of summer, was a small stone cottage where lived James Richardson, a young pilot in the Royal Air Force. The war had already taken so much from the village, its young men, its peace, and its sense of timelessness. Now, it seemed poised to take James too. The day was August 5th, 1942, and the Richardson household was steeped in a somber quietude, a stark contrast to the usual chirping of the birds and the gentle rustling of leaves in the summer breeze. James, dressed in his RAF uniform, stood at the threshold, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His mother, a stout woman with hair the color of storm clouds, fought back tears as she adjusted the collar of his jacket. "You make sure to stay safe, you hear me?" she said, her voice quivering with the effort of maintaining composure. His father, a sturdy man weathered by years of labor in the fields, placed a firm hand on James's shoulder. "We're proud of you, son. Always remember that," he said, his voice steady but eyes betraying a well of concern. James offered a reassuring smile, though inside his heart was a tumult of emotions: pride, fear, excitement, and a gnawing sense of uncertainty mingled within him. His younger sister, Ellie, clung to him, her small fingers gripping his arm. "Don't go, James," she whispered, her eyes wide and glistening. "I have to, Elle. It's something I must do," James replied, kneeling to hug her. "I'll be back before you know it, and I'll bring you stories from across the sea." The village clock struck 9, its chimes echoing through the air, signaling it was time to leave. James picked up his bag and stepped out of the house, turning to wave at his family one last time. As he walked towards the village square, where a military vehicle awaited him, the faces of his neighbors appeared in windows and doorways, offering nods of respect and murmurs of "good luck." The ride to the RAF base was a blur, his mind adrift in thoughts of the mission ahead. The details were scarce: a secret operation, requiring a select group of pilots to fly to America, something about a new radar technology that could turn the tide of the war. The gravity of the task was not lost on James, and he felt the weight of responsibility on his young shoulders. Arriving at the base, he was greeted by the sight of several other pilots, each absorbed in their thoughts, their expressions a mix of determination and apprehension. Squadron Leader Thompson, a tall man with a stern face and sharp eyes, briefed them with the little information he could divulge. "Gentlemen, this mission is of utmost importance. You will be flying to America, carrying with you equipment that is vital for our efforts in this war. I expect discipline, discretion, and bravery from each of you. Remember, you're not just representing the RAF. You're representing our country." The pilots listened intently, absorbing the gravity of their task. James felt a surge of pride. He was part of something crucial, something larger than himself. As the meeting concluded, the men dispersed to prepare for the journey ahead. The airfield was bustling with activity, ground crews readying the planes, the roar of engines, the smell of fuel and oil permeating the air. That night, as James lay in the barracks, staring at the ceiling, the reality of his mission settled in. He was about to embark on a journey across the ocean, to a land he had only read about in books. His thoughts wandered to his family, to the village, and to the war that had engulfed the world. Sleep eventually claimed him, but it was restless, filled with dreams of thunderous skies and unknown horizons. In the gray light of dawn, as the first rays of the sun kissed the edge of the sky, James and his squadron took to the air. The planes, sleek Spitfires, glinted in the morning light as they ascended, disappearing into the vast blue expanse. Below them, England stretched out, a tapestry of green fields and sleepy villages, unaware of the brave souls soaring above, carrying with them the hopes of a nation. The Scottish coastline emerged below, rugged and windswept, a stark contrast to the serene English countryside James had left behind. The RAF base, hidden amongst the rolling hills and craggy cliffs, was a flurry of secretive activity, its very existence known to only a few. As James's Spitfire touched down on the runway, a sense of purpose filled the air. This was no ordinary RAF base. It was the heart of clandestine operations, a place where the most critical and secretive missions were born. James was greeted by Squadron Leader Thompson, whose piercing gaze seemed to evaluate him in a new light. Around him, other pilots from various parts of the UK gathered, each selected for their skill and unwavering courage. They were a diverse group, some young like James, others seasoned veterans of the skies. Their unit was an assembly of the best, tasked with a mission that could alter the course of the war. The pilots were ushered into a briefing room, a stark, dimly lit space that smelled of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Thompson stood at the front, beside a large map of the Atlantic and the eastern coast of the United States. "Gentlemen," Thompson began, his voice stern, "you've been chosen for your exceptional flying skills and your ability to handle confidential information. Our mission is to transport a new type of radar technology to our allies in America. This equipment," he gestured to a set of large, covered crates, "is crucial for the development of countermeasures against German U-boats, which have been wreaking havoc in the Atlantic." The room was silent, each pilot absorbing the gravity of their task. The new radar technology, if successful, could shift the balance of naval power in the Allies' favor. "You will fly in two groups, each taking different routes to avoid detection. These paths have been carefully plotted to minimize the risk of encountering enemy aircraft or submarines. However, the journey will be perilous. You'll face unpredictable weather, long stretches over open water, and the constant threat of the enemy." James listened intently, his mind racing with tactics and strategies. The mission was unlike anything he had undertaken, a long-haul flight across treacherous waters, carrying precious cargo. The next few days were a blur of intense preparation. James and his fellow pilots underwent briefings on navigation, survival at sea, and the handling of the new radar equipment. They practiced long-distance flying, honing their skills for the journey ahead. In the evenings, the pilots gathered in the base's small mess hall, sharing stories and forming bonds. Despite their different backgrounds, they were united by a common purpose. James found camaraderie with a pilot named Thomas, a witty Scotsman with a knack for lifting spirits. On the eve of their departure, James stood by his aircraft, gazing at the crates of radar equipment being carefully loaded. He thought of his family, the village, and the immense responsibility resting on his shoulders. He wasn't just a pilot anymore, he was a courier of hope. As dawn broke, the secret squadron lined up on the runway. The engines roared to life, a symphony of power and determination. One by one, the Spitfires took to the sky, ascending into the early morning mist. James took one last look at the Scottish coast as it faded into the distance. Ahead lay the vast Atlantic, a daunting expanse of blue uncertainty. But within him burned a steadfast resolve. He was ready for the challenge, ready to play his part in the grand scheme of the war. With a final check of his instruments, James set his course westward, towards America, towards the unknown. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out beneath James and his squadron, an endless expanse of deep blue. They were hours into their flight, the coast of Scotland now just a memory. The skies were clear, but the tension within each pilot was palpable. They knew the biggest threats lay hidden, in the clouds above and the waters below. James periodically checked his instruments, ensuring he was on the correct course. The Spitfires, although not designed for such long-distance flights, had been modified with additional fuel tanks. Every drop of fuel was precious, and James was acutely aware of the balance between speed, altitude, and fuel consumption. As they flew on, the weather began to shift. Dark clouds gathered on the horizon, an ominous sign in the open ocean. James recalled the briefings on weather conditions and the importance of staying on course. The squadron adjusted its formation, preparing to face the brewing storm. The turbulence hit them first, jostling the planes like leaves in a gust. James tightened his grip on the controls, his eyes fixed on the gauges. The Spitfires dipped and swayed, buffeted by the increasingly hostile winds. "Stay sharp, everyone. Keep formation as best you can," crackled Squadron Leader Thompson's voice over the radio. James glanced at his fellow pilots, their faces etched with concentration, visible through the cockpit glass. They were each alone in their struggle against the storm, but united by their mission. Then, without warning, a harsher challenge presented itself. The radio buzzed with a new voice, tense and urgent. "Contact! Possible U-boat sighting below. Keep alert." James's heart skipped a beat. German U-boats were notorious for their deadly efficiency, and even though they were in aircraft, the threat was real. A U-boat sighting could mean the presence of enemy reconnaissance or even a full attack. He scanned the ocean below, his eyes searching for any sign of the enemy. The water was a canvas of churning waves and whitecaps, revealing nothing. The squadron pressed on, battling the dual threats of nature and enemy. As the hours passed, the storm slowly receded, leaving behind a calm that felt almost eerie. James let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. They had made it through unscathed, but their journey was far from over. Night began to fall, cloaking the world in darkness. Flying at night, especially over the ocean, was a daunting prospect. The vast, featureless seascape offered no points of reference, no landmarks to guide their way. The pilots relied solely on their instruments and the stars above. James felt a profound isolation as the darkness enveloped his plane. He thought of his family, wondering what they were doing at that very moment. The war seemed both distant and all-encompassing, a contradiction that lived in the heart of every soldier. Hours turned into an endless stretch of vigilance and endurance. Fatigue began to set in, but James knew he couldn't let his guard down. The safety of the squadron and the success of their mission depended on each pilot's resilience. As dawn broke, casting a soft light over the horizon, a sense of relief washed over James. They were still hours away from their destination, but the rising sun brought renewed energy and hope. The radio crackled to life once more, this time with Thompson's voice sounding more relaxed. "Good job, everyone. We're through the worst of it. Let's bring this home." The squadron reformed, the Spitfires drawing closer together as they neared the American coastline. James allowed himself a small smile. They had faced the challenges of the Atlantic and emerged stronger, but the mission was not yet complete. The most critical part still lay ahead: the delivery of the radar technology to their American allies. The coast of America was now in sight, a welcome view after the endless ocean. It was a new land, filled with unknowns, but James felt ready to face whatever lay ahead. He adjusted his course, following the coastline towards their destination, towards the next chapter of their extraordinary journey. As the American coastline came into view, a sense of achievement filled the cockpit. James gazed down at the sprawling land beneath him, its vastness striking a stark contrast to the dense, compact geography of the British Isles. However, this moment of triumph was short-lived. The radio, which had been their lifeline across the Atlantic, crackled with an unexpected directive. "Attention, squadron. Divert your course immediately. Severe weather system approaching your trajectory. Reroute to these coordinates." The voice of the ground control was firm, relaying a new set of coordinates. They were being directed north, towards a remote part of Canada. James felt a twinge of unease. This diversion was more than a minor inconvenience. It significantly altered their mission plan. The squadron adjusted their headings, veering off their intended path, and headed towards the unknown. As they approached the Canadian coastline, the weather, as forewarned, turned treacherous. Thick clouds loomed ominously, and gusts of wind buffeted the plains. The new route was a challenge to navigate, with the landscape below a mix of dense forests and rugged terrain, devoid of the familiar signs of civilization. Fuel was another growing concern. The additional distance and the demanding flying conditions were depleting their reserves faster than anticipated. James could sense the collective anxiety amongst the squadron. Every pilot knew that they were in a precarious situation. "Squadron, we need to land. We're running low on fuel, and this weather isn't letting up." Thompson's voice was tense but composed over the radio. Below them, nestled in a valley surrounded by towering pines, lay a small clearing. It was far from ideal, but it was their best option. One by one, the Spitfires descended, their engines roaring against the howling wind. James's heart raced as he maneuvered his plane towards the ground. The makeshift airstrip was rough, the terrain uneven. With a final, determined effort, he touched down, the plane jolting as it hit the ground. The rest of the squadron followed, each landing a testament to their skill and courage. They had landed in a remote Canadian village, a world away from the bustling streets of London or the orderly rows of English countryside. The village, a collection of wooden houses and log cabins, seemed almost frozen in time, untouched by the chaos of war. The villagers, alerted by the sound of the planes, gathered around, their expressions a mix of curiosity and caution. They were a hardy folk, used to the harsh Canadian wilderness, but the arrival of a British squadron was an event beyond their wildest imaginings. James and his fellow pilots emerged from their planes, weary but relieved to be on solid ground. The language barrier was evident, as most villagers spoke only French, but the warmth of their welcome needed no translation. "We need to contact our base. Let them know where we are and arrange for fuel," Thompson said to his men. He turned to the villagers, his gestures trying to convey their predicament. A middle-aged man who introduced himself as Jean seemed to understand. With a mix of broken English and hand signals, he assured them that they could use the village's radio to make contact. That evening, the villagers opened their homes to the squadron. They shared what little they had, offering meals and a place to rest. Despite the unexpected detour, James felt a sense of camaraderie with these strangers, united by the universal language of hospitality and kindness. In the warmth of Jean's cabin, as he sat with a bowl of stew, James reflected on the journey so far. They had traveled far from home, faced the wrath of the Atlantic, and now found themselves in this secluded village, reliant on the generosity of people they had never met. The war, with all its horror and complexity, seemed a world away. Here, in this remote part of Canada, James found a sense of peace, a reminder of the humanity that persisted even in the darkest of times. Tomorrow, they would continue their journey to America. But for tonight, they were simply grateful guests in a village that time forgot, a serendipitous refuge in the vast tapestry of war. The morning light filtered softly through the dense canopy of the Canadian wilderness, casting a serene glow over the village. James and his squadron, refreshed by the unexpected hospitality, prepared for the next leg of their journey. However, as they were about to depart, an unforeseen complication arose. Jean, the villager who had been their primary contact, approached Squadron Leader Thompson with a look of grave concern. With him was a young boy, no more than 10, his eyes wide with fear. In broken English, interspersed with anxious glances, Jean relayed the boy's story. The boy had been playing near the outskirts of the village when he stumbled upon a hidden campsite. He described seeing a strange man, foreign in appearance, with equipment that looked suspiciously like a radio transmitter. Thompson's expression hardened. This was alarming news. A German operative in this remote area could only mean one thing. They were tracking Allied movements, possibly even theirs. "Secure the planes and set up a perimeter. No one takes off until we assess this threat," Thompson ordered, his voice laced with urgency. James felt a knot of tension form in his stomach. The mission had taken an unexpected turn into the realm of espionage and danger. The pilots quickly transformed from aviators to soldiers, their training kicking in. Dividing into groups, with some staying to guard the planes, James joined Thompson and a few others to investigate the boy's discovery. They moved cautiously through the dense forest, the underbrush crackling underfoot. After a tense hike, they arrived at the location. Hidden amongst the trees was indeed a campsite. It was deserted, but the remnants of a fire and the equipment left behind were telling. Amongst the items was a radio setup capable of long-range communication. "It's a spy, all right. He must have been observing our landing and reporting back to the Germans," Thompson muttered, examining the radio. James felt a chill run down his spine. The presence of a German operative so far from the front lines was a stark reminder of the war's far-reaching shadows. "We need to find him before he reports back or worse, sabotages our planes," said James, aware of the urgency. The group set out to track the spy, fanning out to cover more ground. The quiet of the forest was a stark contrast to the roar of aircraft engines and the bustle of military life that they were accustomed to. As they searched, James's mind raced with possibilities. Were they being watched at that very moment? Was the enemy amongst them, cloaked by the dense foliage? After hours of fruitless searching, they returned to the village, the weight of unease heavy upon them. Thompson made the decision to proceed with the mission despite the potential risk. Time was of the essence, and they couldn't afford further delays. The pilots returned to their aircraft, their senses heightened. The villagers gathered to see them off, their faces etched with worry but also with a silent strength. They understood the stakes, even if they were far removed from the battlefields. As James climbed into his cockpit, he took a moment to look back at the village. These people, so isolated from the world, had shown them unexpected kindness, and now they shared the burden of war. The engines roared to life, breaking the morning stillness. One by one, the Spitfires took off, ascending into the sky. James felt a mix of relief and apprehension as the village receded below him. The encounter with the unseen enemy was a stark reminder that the war was a shadow that stretched far and wide, touching even the most remote corners of the world. With the American coastline once again in their sights, the squadron flew on, each pilot acutely aware of the invisible threats that lurked around them. The mission was far from over, and the real challenge still lay ahead. The squadron soared over the rugged coastline, the vast expanse of America unfolding beneath them. The tension from the unexpected detour in Canada lingered, but the sight of their destination reignited a sense of purpose in James. They were close to completing this crucial leg of their mission. As they approached the designated airfield, a sprawling military complex came into view. It was a stark contrast to the remote Canadian village they had left behind. The base was abuzz with activity, with rows of aircraft lined up and ground crews moving briskly about their tasks. James guided his Spitfire down the runway, the plane touching down with a smooth precision honed by countless hours of flying. One by one, the other members of the squadron landed, each pilot visibly relieved to have reached their destination safely. They were greeted by a contingent of American military personnel, who quickly ushered them to a briefing room. The atmosphere was formal, a reminder that they were now on an active military base, a crucial hub in the Allies' war effort. The American commander, a tall man with a commanding presence, welcomed them. "Your arrival has been eagerly anticipated," he said. "The technology you've brought is vital to our joint efforts in the Atlantic. You've done your country a great service by getting it here." The crates containing the radar equipment were carefully unloaded and taken away for immediate integration and testing. James watched, a sense of accomplishment mingling with curiosity about this new land and its people. The pilots were given a brief respite to refresh themselves before being debriefed. James took the opportunity to explore the base. The scale of everything was astonishing. The vastness of the airfield, the size of the hangars, and the number of aircraft. Everything in America seemed larger, more expansive than back home. As he walked, James observed the American servicemen and women. Their accents, mannerisms, and even their uniforms were different, yet there was a shared sense of purpose and determination that was familiar. They were allies, united against a common enemy. Later, at the debriefing, the pilots were informed about the next phase of their mission. They would remain in America for a short period, assisting with the implementation of the new radar technology and participating in joint training exercises. That evening, the squadron was invited to a communal dinner at the base. The meal was a lively affair, with American and British personnel sharing stories and experiences. James found himself seated next to an American pilot, a young man named Jack who was eager to hear about the RAF's exploits in Europe. "We've heard so much about the Battle of Britain, the Blitz over London," Jack said. "It's an honor to meet someone who's been on the front lines of it all." James shared stories of his experiences, the dogfights over the English Channel, the nights spent in air raid shelters, and the camaraderie among his fellow pilots. In turn, Jack spoke of life in America, the war's impact on everyday life, and the growing mobilization across the country. The conversation gave James a new perspective on the global scale of the war. It was one thing to know it intellectually, quite another to see and hear it firsthand. America, with its vast resources and diverse population, was a world unto itself, yet deeply connected to the conflict raging across the ocean. As the evening drew to a close, James felt a renewed sense of camaraderie, not just with his fellow Brits, but with their American allies. The war had brought them together, forging bonds across oceans and continents. Returning to his quarters, James reflected on the day's events. The mission had taken them to unexpected places, both geographically and emotionally. They had reached America, and it was indeed the most unusual sight for them, a land of contrasts and possibilities, now an integral part of their shared fight for freedom. Tomorrow, they would begin joint operations, a crucial step in strengthening the Allied forces. But for tonight, James rested, his thoughts drifting between his home in England and the vast, sprawling land he now found himself in, a world away, yet united in a common cause. The following days at the American base were a whirlwind of activity for James and his squadron. The joint operations involved rigorous training exercises, combining the skills of the RAF pilots with the tactics of their American counterparts. This collaboration was vital not only for the implementation of the new radar technology, but also for fostering a deeper understanding between the two forces. James found himself adapting to the American way of military life, which was both similar and markedly different from what he was used to. The Americans had a more relaxed manner in some respects, yet were intensely focused and innovative in their approach to warfare. During one training exercise, James flew alongside American pilots in their P-51 Mustangs, a fighter he had heard much about but never seen up close. The Mustangs were faster and more agile than he expected, and their pilots were skilled and confident. It was a learning experience for James, who had grown accustomed to the Spitfire's capabilities. Off the airfield, James and his fellow RAF pilots were introduced to American culture. They were taken to a nearby town where they experienced the bustling life of a wartime American city. The streets were alive with music, the windows of shops and diners glowing warmly in the evening light. James was struck by the contrast between this vibrant scene and the war-torn cities of Europe. Here, the war felt distant, even as its effects were evident in the ration lines and the presence of military personnel. It was a different kind of wartime experience, one that was both foreign and fascinating to him. One evening, the squadron was invited to a local dance. The event was a lively affair, with big band music filling the air. James found himself swept up in the energy of the night, dancing with a young woman named Emily, who worked at a nearby factory producing aircraft parts. She shared stories of her life in America, of her family, and her hopes for the future. As they talked, James realized how the war had touched lives in myriad ways, uniting people across the world in a common struggle. Emily's perspective on the war, as someone contributing to the effort from home, was both enlightening and humbling. In the days that followed, the squadron continued their joint exercises. They also participated in demonstrations of the new radar equipment, which proved to be a game-changer in detecting and tracking enemy aircraft. The success of their mission was becoming evident, and there was a sense of pride among the pilots. However, amidst the training and cultural exchanges, James couldn't help but feel a growing homesickness. The experiences in America were enriching, but they also highlighted the distance from his family and the life he knew. He missed the rolling hills of England, the familiar streets of his village, and the comforting presence of his loved ones. As their time in America drew to a close, James reflected on the journey they had undertaken. They had traversed the Atlantic, faced unforeseen challenges, and delivered crucial technology to their allies. Along the way, they had formed bonds with their American counterparts, gaining new insights and perspectives. The mission had been more than a military operation. It had been an adventure that broadened their horizons in unexpected ways. James realized that he would be returning home not just as a pilot, but as a man who had seen a different part of the world and who had been changed by it. The final day at the base arrived, and the squadron prepared for their journey back to England. They said their goodbyes to the American pilots and the friends they had made, promises to write and stay in touch exchanged with sincere intentions. As James climbed into his Spitfire, he took one last look at the American base, its runways stretching out beneath the vast sky. He felt a mixture of sadness and gratitude, knowing that this experience would stay with him long after the war was over. With the roar of engines, the squadron took to the skies, heading east towards home. They left America behind, but they carried with them new skills, memories, and a deeper understanding of their allies across the ocean. The war continued, but they were returning with renewed strength and resolve, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The journey back to England was a reflective one for James and his squadron. The skies over the Atlantic were a familiar canvas of blues and grays, but their perspective had shifted. They were not the same men who had embarked on this mission. They were returning with new experiences and a broader view of the war and their role in it. The flight was long and taxing, demanding the utmost focus and endurance from each pilot. They flew in tight formation, conserving fuel and providing mutual support. The vast ocean below was a constant reminder of the distance they had traveled and the vastness of the world they were fighting to protect. As they neared the British coastline, emotions ran high. For James, the sight of his homeland brought a surge of relief and a profound sense of belonging. The green fields and rugged cliffs of England were a stark contrast to the sprawling landscapes of America and the remote wilderness of Canada. Landing at their home base was a moment of triumph mixed with melancholy. The ground crew and their commanding officers welcomed them back with cheers and pats on the back, but the joy was tempered by the reality of the ongoing war. Squadron Leader Thompson debriefed them shortly after their return. "Your success in America has significantly bolstered our efforts," he said. "The radar technology you've brought back will be a turning point in the war against the U-boats. You've all done your country a great service." The debriefing was followed by a much-needed rest. James found himself wandering the base, lost in thought. He thought of the American pilots, the lively streets of the town, and Emily's bright smile. He realized how much the journey had broadened his horizons, exposing him to different cultures and ways of life. The following days were a readjustment to the routine of war. The squadron resumed their regular duties, but their experiences in America had changed their approach to their tasks. They brought back not just new technology, but also new tactics and a renewed sense of camaraderie. James penned letters to his family and to the friends he had made in America, recounting his experiences and expressing his hope to return one day under more peaceful circumstances. Writing these letters was therapeutic. It allowed him to process his journey and the multitude of emotions it had stirred. One evening, as James sat in the mess hall with his fellow pilots, they shared stories of their time in America. The conversation was light-hearted, but there was an underlying sense of gravity. They had been part of something significant, a mission that had strengthened the bonds between allies and brought hope in a time of uncertainty. As time passed, the squadron's experience in America became a cherished memory, a bright spot in the relentless grind of war. They were once again immersed in the reality of air raids, reconnaissance missions, and dogfights. Yet, the lessons they had learned and the friendships they had formed continued to inspire them. James found himself looking up at the sky often, his thoughts drifting to the vast expanse of the Atlantic and the land beyond. The war was far from over, but he felt ready to face its challenges with a new perspective. Their journey had been more than a mission. It had been a testament to the power of unity and cooperation. In the face of a global conflict, it was alliances like the one they had strengthened with their American counterparts that would pave the way to victory. As James lay in his bunk at night listening to the distant rumble of aircraft engines, he realized that the war had changed him in ways he could never have imagined. He had left as a pilot and returned as a bridge between worlds, forever altered by his journey across the Atlantic. The war-weary streets of James's village were a stark contrast to the bustling life he had witnessed in America. As he walked down the familiar lanes with their cobblestone paths and quaint houses, a wave of nostalgia washed over him. The village had remained largely unchanged, a timeless capsule in the midst of a world at war. James's arrival was met with a warm reception. His family embraced him, their relief and pride evident in their tearful smiles and tight hugs. His mother had prepared a hearty meal, filling the house with the comforting aromas of home-cooked food. Sitting at the dinner table, James shared stories of his journey. He spoke of the vast American landscapes, the warmth of the Canadian villagers, and the camaraderie with the American pilots. His family listened, captivated by his tales, their eyes reflecting a mix of wonder and concern. The next day, word of James's return had spread, and he was greeted by neighbors and friends eager to hear about his adventures. He became a local hero of sorts, a young man from their own village who had flown across the Atlantic and back, contributing to the war effort in a significant way. But amidst the welcome and attention, James felt a sense of dislocation. The village, with its slow pace and sheltered life, seemed disconnected from the realities he had experienced. He found himself missing the adrenaline of missions, the solidarity of his squadron, and even the vibrant energy of the American base. In the following weeks, James often visited the local pub, where he was greeted with pats on the back and rounds of drinks. The villagers hung on his every word as he recounted his experiences. But as the evenings wore on, the conversations invariably returned to the war, the rationing, the losses, and the lingering fear of what the future held. James also noticed the subtle changes the war had brought to his village. There were fewer young men on the streets, and the ones who remained carried the weight of the war in their eyes. The women had taken on roles left vacant by those who had gone to fight, their resilience a quiet force in the community. One clear night, as James walked home from the pub, he looked up at the star-filled sky. It was the same sky under which he had flown across the Atlantic, the same stars that had guided him to America and back. Yet, beneath these stars, the village felt like a different world. James realized that his journey had changed him. He had seen more of the world, understood more of the war, and met people from walks of life vastly different from his own. He had returned home, but a part of him remained with the skies he had traversed, the people he had met, and the experiences he had lived. As he lay in bed that night, the quiet of the village surrounding him, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. His role in the war was not just about flying missions. It was about bridging the gaps between different worlds, bringing back stories and lessons that could inspire and give hope. The war continued, its end still uncertain, but James faced it with a new perspective. He was no longer just a pilot from a small English village. He was a part of a larger, interconnected world fighting for a common cause. And in that realization lay the strength and resilience to carry on, to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the weeks following his return, the rhythm of life in the village and at the RAF base gradually pulled James back into the fold of war. The comforting familiarity of home had given way to a renewed sense of duty. The war, with all its grim realities, remained a constant presence, its end still a distant hope. James reconnected with his squadron, many of whom had been on their own missions. They exchanged stories and experiences, each narrative adding to the tapestry of war that they were all a part of. The tales from America, Canada, and the journey across the Atlantic were met with awe and curiosity. As the squadron resumed their duties, James found himself in a leadership role. His experience in America had not only broadened his perspective, but also enhanced his skills. He was more confident in his decisions, more adept at navigating the challenges that each mission presented. The RAF was now equipped with the new radar technology that James and his squadron had transported from America. The impact of this advancement was significant. It improved their ability to detect and intercept German aircraft, giving the Allies a much-needed edge in the ongoing air battles. James often thought of the friends he had made in America and Canada, wondering how they were faring. He wrote letters when he could, describing life back in England and the continued efforts of the RAF. The responses he received were a lifeline, connecting him to the world beyond the war-torn skies of Europe. The war, however, was unrelenting. News from the front line spoke of both victories and losses, each report a reminder of the unpredictable nature of war. James experienced this firsthand during missions, where triumph and tragedy were often mere moments apart. One late afternoon, as James returned from a particularly grueling mission, he learned of a major development in the war. The Allies had launched a significant offensive in Europe. It was a bold move, one that carried the hope of turning the tide of the war. The base buzzed with a cautious optimism. This offensive could be the beginning of the end of the war, a chance to push back against the forces that had brought so much devastation. In the ensuing weeks, the pace of operations intensified. James and his squadron were tasked with more frequent sorties, providing air support for the ground forces and engaging enemy aircraft with renewed vigor. Each mission was a blend of fear, adrenaline, and determination. The skies over Europe were a battleground where skill, strategy, and sometimes sheer luck determined the outcome. James flew with the knowledge that each flight could be his last, but also with the belief that what they were doing was essential for the victory of the Allies. As the war progressed, the news from the front lines was increasingly positive. The Allied offensive was making significant gains, pushing the enemy back and liberating occupied territories. The tide was turning, but the cost was high, and the fight was far from over. James, like so many others, continued to play his part in this vast, complex conflict. The war had taken him across oceans, introduced him to new allies, and shown him the resilience of the human spirit. As he prepared for another mission, strapping himself into the cockpit of his Spitfire, James looked out at the runway, the aircraft lined up like silent sentinels ready for battle. He thought of his family, his friends, and the people he had met along the way. They were all part of this fight, each in their own way. The engine roared to life, the propellers spinning into a blur. James took a deep breath and released the brakes, the plane moving forward, gathering speed. He was ready to face whatever lay ahead, armed with the experiences and lessons of his journey. The war continued, but so did the hope, the courage, and the unyielding determination of those who fought for a better world. James, a pilot from a small English village, was a part of that fight, his story woven into the larger narrative of a world at war, striving for peace. Years had passed since the end of World War II, and the world had transformed in ways both profound and subtle. In a small English village, time seemed to have stood still, preserving the charm and tranquility of a bygone era. But for James Richardson, the village's war hero, time had brought change, healing, and reflection. James sat in his favorite chair by the fireplace, a cup of tea in hand, gazing out the window at the rolling fields that had once been his entire world. The memories of the war, once vivid and sharp, had softened with the passing of years. His journey during the war, the secret mission to America, the unexpected detour in Canada, and the return to the war-torn skies of Europe were now chapters in a life marked by courage and resilience. The young, eager pilot who had left this village was now a seasoned man, tempered by the experiences that had shaped him. Around him, the walls were adorned with photographs and mementos of his time in the RAF. Each item told a story, a fragment of the vast tapestry of war in which he had played a part. There were also letters, faded with age, from friends he had made during his journey, including a few from Emily, the spirited young woman he had danced with in America. James often shared his stories with the younger generation, his grandchildren hanging on his every word. He spoke of the bravery, the sacrifices, and the camaraderie, but also of the importance of peace and understanding among nations. The world outside had moved on. Europe had rebuilt itself from the ashes of war, former enemies had become allies, and new challenges had emerged on the global stage. Yet, the lessons of the war remained relevant, a reminder of the costs of conflict and the value of unity. James's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of laughter from the garden. His family was gathered there, a microcosm of the peaceful world he had fought for. He watched them for a moment, a contented smile on his face. Standing up, James walked to the garden, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. Joining his family, he felt a surge of gratitude. The war had taken much from him and from the world, but it had also given him a perspective on life that he cherished deeply. As the day waned and the sky turned a brilliant shade of orange, James felt a profound connection to the past and the present. His story, like that of so many others from the war, was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit in the face of adversity. In the quiet of the English countryside, amidst the laughter of his loved ones, James Richardson, once a pilot in the greatest conflict the world had ever known, found peace. The war was a part of him, but it did not define him. His legacy was one of hope, a beacon for future generations in a world forever changed.